My name is Moriarty. I live in Tempe, Arizona. I was originally from New York. My mother was from County Donegal. My dad's parents were from counties Kerry and Cork. Although all of them missed the famine was never far from their thoughts because their grandparents had lived through the famine. My mother's oldest brother, who remembered his grandfather, who had lived through the famine, was petrified of nursing homes, or at that time known as the county home, because he equated them with the workhouses that went on during the famine. My father had a cousin in Kerry who lived in Toronto, and one year I was down in Kerry with him, and he referred to a few Protestant families as supers. And I said, what was a super? He said, oh, their ancestors changed from Catholicism to Church of Ireland to get the soup during the famine. And that was still kind of looked down upon even in the 1940s and 1950s. Kind of like turncoats. But I don't think anybody, even if they did not live through the famine was always on their minds. A fear of not having enough to eat. My mother used to kid about people that lived in the towns. She was from a farm. She said we were better off because at least we had food. People in the towns had to buy food. But during the famine, they had no food either. And that's why things were kept. Things were not... the Irish probably have the greatest collection of pack rats imaginable. Don't throw things out. You might need it. That is a famine mentality of not having and having to save and squirrel away because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. I live in Tempe, Arizona now. I've been here for 25 years. I'm originally from New York. My mother was from County Donegal. My father's parents were from Cork and Kerry. They lived in New York when New York was Irish. They met and married, and I grew up in the city of New York. My husband, whose grandparents were from Kerry, also grew up in New York. He joined the police department and was promoted to sergeant back just at the time we were married in 1988. We had decided we were going to go to Arizona when he retired. But when you grow up in New York, it's a very Irish city, always was. When I was first married, we'd go out to dinner in an Irish pub restaurant, and I would either know the owner, the bartender, a waitress, or some other guest. And my husband used to kid, can you go anywhere without knowing somebody? I said, no, not in New York. When we decided to come out to Arizona, I had found out that they had an Irish community out here because the IDA had put an ad in the Irish Echo listing all the Irish import shops. And Lorraine Flynn's shop was listed. It never dawned on me that there were Irish in Arizona. I rang her up. We had a nice chat. I must have sounded very an ignorant and arrogant New Yorker wondering if there were Irish in Arizona. She put me in touch with Bob Graham, who was the editor of the Desert Shamrock at that time. Him and I spoke for about 2 hours. He sent me some issues of the Shamrock, and when my husband and I moved down, once we got settled, we joined the Irish Foundation of Arizona, which was basically a social group. And they did the Emerald Ball, which was our St. Patrick's Day dinner dance. They did a spring picnic, a fall picnic, a Christmas in July, a Christmas party. They were really great times. And anyway, the first time I marched in our St. Patrick's Day parade with the foundation, which would have been 97, I remember looking around thinking, this is it. When you come from New York, and we had the oldest and the largest, but a year later I got on the parade committee, and as I always say, we can have what New York, Boston, Chicago cannot have: a huge Irish fair after the parade. You can march without a coat. I've been on the parade committee for the last 23 years. Back in 1999, we dedicated our Hunger Memorial on Gorta Moor. The late Bill O'Brien and Ken Clark and Howard Adams got all the Irish groups together. We ran fundraisers. We raised money. The Hunger Memorial was dedicated September 25th, 1999. And we had a big party under the Central Avenue Bridge. I ran the food for that because I worked for a caterer and was told to buy for between $1,500 and $5,000. It was an interesting day. The day we dedicated the Hunger Memorial was the day we broke ground on Hollamore, the Great Hall, which was dedicated St. Patrick's Day 2002. And it is through our public-private partnership with the City of Phoenix Parks and Recreation Department, because we're in Margaret Hans Park, the Arizona Department of Transportation, because Margaret Hans Park forms the I-10 tunnel, and the Irish Cultural and Learning Foundation. But it was mainly through our sister city relationship with Ennis in County Clare. And the Ennis group came out for the dedication of the hall, and we had a big party that day. And then we started work on our cottage. And the architect, Paul Ahern, who is a genius, he designed the hall, the cottage, and subsequently the McClelland Library. And the cottage was dedicated March 21st, 2004. It is a mirror version of the North Clare farmhouse at Bunratty Folk Park. We had a few years where everything just went on, and then Norm McClelland decided he'd like to have a library, and worked with Paul and the board of the Irish Cultural and Learning Foundation and the community. And on September 29, 2012, we dedicated the library. Our front entry, as well as all the windowsills, are Irish blue limestone that we contracted with Frank McCormick of Irish Natural Stone, who we found when we did the headstone for Annie Moore, who was the first Irish immigrant through Ellis Island. And it turns out we had her grandson's widow and 3 of her great-granddaughters living here. And it turned out Annie was in an unmarked grave in Calvary Cemetery. So we found Frances, got special dispensations to have Irish blue limestone, and in 2008 we had a great ceremony in New York with the Corkman's Association, as well as a lot of the other groups, and a few of us went back for it, to celebrate Annie Moore, who basically is a celebration of all immigration through Ellis Island. Both my grandparents and great aunts and uncles came through, and it must have been a petrifying experience, because my father said growing up that his parents always said, anybody asks you if you have something, you tell them no. Let them find out. I think that came through their experience at Ellis Island. But we will never be the Irish community of a New York, Boston, or Chicago. But what we do not have in numbers, we make up in spirit. And I was operations manager here for 12 years. We had people from all over the world that couldn't believe what we had here in Phoenix, Arizona. But it's a wonderful Irish community. The Great Hunger, as the Irish refer to it, the Great Potato Famine, as it's referred to in history books, was referred to as the greatest catastrophe of the 19th century. Unfortunately, at the time, Ireland was part of Britain, and there were some in Britain who viewed people dying and leaving as ethnic cleansing. Unfortunately, that still goes on today. What I find very interesting is that back in the mid-'80s, it was an Irishman, Bob Geldorf, that decided to do that mega concert, Live Aid, for the hungry in Ethiopia. I don't think there's any Irish or Irish American, no matter how many generations removed from Angor Timor, who does not relate to the Great Hunger, whether it be in history books, whether it be family stories. And I think that the Irish have always been known, even in the bad old days when there wasn't money in Ireland, to be generous to a fault almost. So I think that's something the Irish have to be proud of. We still have hunger going on today, and if you go to the Great Hunger Memorial in New York, not only is that dedicated to the Great Hunger victims, and by the way, Frank McCormick also brought in the stones for that, but it is dedicated also to get the word out of hunger since and to our own time today. But I think having gone through the Great Hunger, the Irish probably will give more to try to alleviate hunger today, which we still have.